All right, I think we're live. Push one in the chat if you can hear me. All right, got a confirmation. Thank you for the confirmation. Welcome back to the Black Brain Trust. This is episode 810, Black Economics. Please hit the like button as you come in, share the video if possible, and hit that notification bell so you get all the updates from the Black Brain Trust. Also, there's a docket in the description of the video for you to follow along with and reference. If you want to get on the panel, there's also a Zoom link in the chat pinned to the top. Make sure you update your Zoom client before joining. All right. Just ask Shar. I've got questions. Long time no see. How are you doing? Little Rock, what's going on? Senku, thanks for joining. Let me share my screen. Let's get started. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's push one in the chat and you can see my screen. Oh, wait, I think I'm muted. No. All right. All right, got a confirmation from the chat. Thank you for the confirmation. We talk about Black venture capital, Black startups, money, affirmative action when it comes to economics. And McKinsey and Company released one of their quarterly reports on underestimating startups, and untapped opportunity. And so what I wanted to do was actually cover this because we've been covering this probably since the inception of this channel, but I like the fact that McKinsey actually produced a report because I think it coincides with a lot of the ideas that we've had and we've discussed over the past few years of the lack of investment into Black startups and Black businesses. So let's actually identify some of the key areas I think would be pressing to Black people. Let's go through this. All right. More access to funding for underrepresented startup founders can unlock massive investment and innovation opportunities. These founders are not just underrepresented, they are underestimated. Okay. Let me zoom in on this. Pervasive societal inequity in the United States is strikingly evident in the startup world. In 2022, Black and Latino founders received only 1% and 1.5%, respectively, of total U.S. venture capital funding. Women-funded teams received 1.9% of VC funds, and only 0.1% of VC funds went to Black and Latino women founders. It's a gap that persists through each stage of growth. Looking at the total funding received across stages for the highest funded startups at the time of exit reveals that the average startup of a white male founder received over $210 million in total funding, while the average startup of an underrepresented founder received a mere 43% of that $91.1 million, okay? just about half. Underrepresented founders from the top funded startups typically receive less funding than their white male counterparts, particularly at exit. So this chart right here is showing you the people who are impacted, the demographics that are impacted. So if we look at Black and purple, we'll see that I think it's purple. Yeah, it should be purple. The total funding received across funding stages. And so what you see down here at the pre-seed stage, Black founders typically raise significantly less than their white male counterparts, okay? And at the seed level, it doesn't really change. It kind of scales up a little bit, but it doesn't really change. At Series A, which is the next step after the seed funding, typically at pre-seed, you have angel funding, but that's not listed here for some reason. Angel funding is usually anywhere between $500 to maybe $5,000 to $20,000. You very rarely see angel funding at 100,000 or more. Okay. It goes over to Series B and it starts to actually dip compared to their white male counterparts at 82%. And we also see at Series C, it doesn't really change all that much. Okay. Women raise more money in general than Black founders, and that includes Black men. And so I think these women are actually white and not necessarily just women in general. I think it's really a representative of white women because even Black women don't raise as much as their white female counterparts. And we saw that with Elizabeth Holmes with the Theranos startup that went bust last year. Okay. And so what we're looking at right here is something that we have been documenting for years on this channel, is that Black founders typically don't raise the necessary venture capital to compete at the grand scale. Okay. Average funding received across funding stages. Okay. Average total funding received by white men founders and average total funding received by underrepresented founders. So that includes Black people. So we can see right here at the pre-seed, even at the pre-seed, Black people would represent in that blue category. They don't raise as much. Now, there's a variety of reasons why this would be the case. You can speculate, and it could be true, that Black founders typically don't have the social networks that white founders do. This would be true. Harvard, Yale, Ivy League, this is true. But even white founders who have not graduated from these institutions typically raise more money too. So that's not necessarily static across the board. All right. So at the seed level, significant increase over Black founders as well. I mean, we covered this just a few seconds ago, but these charts actually show the disproportionate rearing of capital. Okay. Closing this gap is not just the right thing to do, it is also key to driving innovation and unlocking economic gains. Unrepresented founders often create companies such as Spanx, 23andMe, and Fenty Beauty that have the potential to outperform their peers and tap into underserved markets. This is true, right? Spanx, founded by a woman, 23andMe, I think that was founded by a woman as well. And I think Fenty was founded by Rihanna, right? Now, Fenty is in the $1 billion valuation right now. It's a unicorn company for beauty and lifestyle of clothing. But what's interesting about Fenty is that Fenty does not necessarily represent the typical. It's an it's an exception to the rule. And so while these founders like Spanx, 23andMe, and Fenty may have raised significant amount of capital, that's not the golden rule here. And so I think sometimes it's good to highlight the successes, but we also have to understand how do we replicate that same success across the board. Okay, it's one thing to catch lightning in the bottle, but I can guarantee you're not going to do that twice. Our research into the economic state of Latinos and Black Americans suggests that in a parity scenario, Black and Latino-owned businesses would generate an additional $1.6 trillion and $2.3 trillion, respectively, assuming Black and Latino-owned business ownership match their share of the population and their business revenues match those of their peers. Beyond the larger macroeconomic gains, founders with greater gender and ethnic diversity achieve 30% higher returns for investors upon exit than their white men founder counterparts. This is true, okay? Many people have said, Black people have a $1.2 trillion economy. This is really what they mean, okay? We're not talking about the ability to buy Jordans and flat screen TVs and iPhones and stuff. We're talking about what value do you actually add to the market if things were all equal, okay? If they were reflective of the demographics and the equality at the level that it needs to be, then you would actually raise and generate this much if you took away all the systemic issues, which is why you have affirmative action. But that's, you have people in this space who will say, well, Black men didn't really benefit from affirmative action, or we don't really need affirmative action. I mean, you really have content creators and panelists and chat thoughts who basically parrot these sort of talking points, but don't really understand that we're talking about $1.6 trillion, okay? We're talking about more than Super Chats, more than Cash Apps, more than your Zelles and your Venmos, okay? More than your PayPals. PayPal's not even gonna move this kind of money for you, okay? In this report, we set out to highlight the stories behind them to dig into the specific challenges for underrepresented founders that have resulted in such a disproportionate gap in investment opportunities. We heard the stories behind the data through interviews with over 50 founders and other stakeholders within the startup ecosystem, including VC funds, limited partners, LPs, and accelerators. And to identify the highest priority areas, we complemented these interviews with a survey of startup founders in March and April 2023, with 161 total respondents, including 80 women and 80 Black, Indigenous people of color, okay? The underrepresented founder experience is littered with challenges. All founders experience roadblocks when creating new, innovative businesses. Underrepresented founders, however, experience greater hurdles. These challenges tend to fall into the four big rock categories that compound over time and lead to a representation gap in the overall founder population. Let me fix this real quick. Big rock number one, systemic limited access to startup network, community support, and resources. I mentioned that earlier, and that's something that we've talked about for a long time, that these issues are systemic, and that's why you have things like affirmative action and DEI in place, was to actually address some of these systemic issues, right? In the United States, white families on average have 13 times the wealth of Black families and 6 times that of Hispanic families. Founders who are less connected to wealthy communities tend to know fewer people who are willing to use their financial and social capital for support. Underrepresented founders are disproportionately developing relationships from cold outreach rather than a warm introduction, which is much less likely to work. They also tend to be less exposed to entrepreneurial, educational, and investor networks, which bring resources that can help their companies grow. They are also likely to have personal savings they can use to begin the journey. Most Black people, we've talked about this during the pandemic, right? Barely have $400 in their savings account for an emergency. You want these people to put $400 into their startup? Not likely. Okay. Underrepresented founders are often tokenized. They tend to be offered a barrage of programs to mentor or support them, but don't provide meaningful help, connections, or long-term contracts. This mentorship without social capital on the line, as one investor pointed out, is useless. You can mentor me until you turn blue in the face, but if you're not willing to put your social capital at play, it's pointless. This is true. Okay. I mean, we see that in the manosphere, right? You know, a lot of these discussions revolve around so-called economics and so-called, you know, tech talk, but none of it really manifests into anything. And that's pretty much what's happening in the startup space. A lot of banter, but nothing really actionable. Big rock number 2, the need to overcome biases related to founder perception. When underrepresented founders interact with the startup ecosystem, they face unconscious biases based on their gender, ethnicity, or cultural background. Their outward appearances influence how customers, investors, co-founders, and other stakeholders respond, most often in less favorable ways. Many underrepresented founders have a myriad of stories about being doubted by investors on their expertise, dismissed for their naivety, and questioned on their dedication to their company. You know, this is interesting, right? A company like Airbnb, which shut down during the pandemic, raised lots and lots of money. But during the pandemic, when everything was shut down and remote work was the go-to for a lot of companies, WeWork became a useless business. No one was going back into the office, but that did not stop them from raising money, right? And so people who look like them, helped them raise a lot of money, invested in, put a lot of venture capital into it. But it was easy to see from a long-term perspective, from long-term planning, that in the event that you have to shut down, what are you going to do? Their business went belly up. Okay. Many underrepresented founders have a myriad of stories about being doubted by investors on their expertise, dismissed for their naivety, and questioned on their dedication to their company. 3 factors that influence investors' bias. Our research shows 3 conditions that influence investor bias towards underrepresented founders. Number 1, a founder's affinity influences the willingness to invest. Having an identity that matches investors' expectations bestows a halo of expertise upon the founder. Well, Black folks, especially Black men, don't look like, Zuckerberg, or they don't look like Steve Jobs or Andy Jassy, or name your tech tycoon. They just don't look like them. So the relationship is going to be radically different. Number 2, enunciation of words and that sort of culture. When I speak, I'm a Black man. When, one of these other, like the founder of OpenAI, he's a white man. That's just the reality. That's the sort of society we live in. And so they may not be as much as leeway given to me that they're going to give to him, even if he knows less than I do. Okay. Number 2, a founder's gender or ethnic background matches that of the investor. For example, 16% of women reported that their investors were mostly women, compared to only 1% of men. Number 3, one of the co-founders is a white man. One investor confided, quote, "There are many instances where diverse founders have been told to bring cis, straight, white men into leadership positions because of the likelihood of raising capital increases significantly. This is pure discrimination that is particularly present in later stage and growth rounds." I mean, it doesn't get more plain than that, right? And so that's what we're dealing with here. I see Ike is in the chat. He says customers don't care. Build a great product, they will buy it. Yeah, but you can't raise the money. What difference does it make? You got to be able to raise the money first, right? You can't raise the same money as your white male counterpart. Well, what difference does the product doesn't mean anything? I mean, the data is data. This is McKinsey and Company. If you think that they're wrong, Ike, the email is in the article. You could always email them. I mean, we're looking at the data. The data's here. Okay, the data's here. The data doesn't lie. I mean, you can make data lie, but in this instance, the data's not lying. Okay, we've covered this the last 5 years. You're not raising more money than white male. That's just not happening. To my knowledge, it's not happening. All right. Big rock number 3, limited established blueprint for success. While startup investors, particularly in venture capital, are making high risk, high growth bets, their decisions are predicated on historical pattern matching when deciding which companies may be relatively lower risk. This can be a difficult barrier to cross for underrepresented founders whose ideas, solutions, or business models, by nature of being on the cusp of innovation, don't align with historical precedent. An immigrant founder described how some investors struggle to understand the revenue potential of her target market. Quote, I realized that Hispanics were always an afterthought. Innovation and technology were not happening in the Hispanic marketplace because nobody was paying attention. That's testimony. That's testimony from one of the founders. Now, I think it also depends on what the Latino or Hispanic person looks like as well. I think if you look like Al Horford or you look like Roberto Clemente, it might be a little bit more different than, let's say, Marco Rubio, trying to raise capital. I think that plays a significant role too. There is a lot of discrimination and, if not, microaggressions against people who have more melanated skin. Big rock number 4, a greater need for mental health resilience. In the face of the first 3 compounding challenges, underrepresented founders are asked to carry an outsized mental burden that requires dogged perseverance with immense resilience and grit. Underrepresentation creates isolation, representation empowers. For those who don't have role models like them or close communities to rely on, it can be a lonely journey. One Black founder told us that he initially struggled to see himself as an entrepreneur. Now that he is one, he feels isolated from both the startup ecosystem and his own community. The journey can feel especially isolating when failure doesn't feel like an option. No founder wants to fail, but underrepresented founders are often carrying the burden of success on behalf of their whole community, not just themselves. Several Black founders in particular express frustration about having to excel while working twice as hard to get half as far. This is so true. Okay, this is very true. Use the Brain Trust for example. We have to carry the burden of the Black manosphere while not raising any money at all. No super chats, no Cash Apps, no Venmos, no Zeals, no PayPals. Okay. And so we're always forced to provide the burden of proof on everything we talk about, while other content creators never have to do that. Okay. They never have to provide any burden of proof on what they're talking about, but we always have to come with the burden of proof like we're reading right here. No different. As a white, A founder's journey, 6 significant inflection points. Through our research, we identified 6 inflection points that, due to the compounding big rock challenges, can change the trajectory of the underrepresented founder's journey. At each inflection point, more underrepresented founders drop out of the journey. Please note that this is not an exhaustive list of reasons. It is rather meant to paint a picture of why the gap in representation is what it is. It represents the key points in the journey, but is not a formula. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to starting and scaling a company. This is true. Okay, this is very true. I think narrative plays a second and third point, or adds another leg to the stool of the discourse, because the data, you know, I mean, you're pulling the data from somewhere, but it still represents something, but you also have to put a story behind it because there has to be a lived experience. So the narrative follows a lived experience, okay? Who are these founders? What was, you know, the experience? And what does the data say, right? So these 3 things, these three target points matter in reflection to the rationale as to why we have this underrepresentation, okay? In fact, we just covered an article a couple of days ago on space and technology, right? And we was talking about the Department of Defense's $100 billion to Division 1, Tier 1 institutes, and HBCUs were only getting 0.5% of that $100 billion, okay? The rest of that money was going to white or predominantly white institutions. And so there was apprehension in giving opportunities to HBCUs like Howard or Morehouse or whatnot, because they didn't actually have a track record. Well, they didn't have a track record because they were being discriminated against, okay? All founders are likely to encounter 6 inflection points along the startup journey. Inflection points along a founder's journey: phase and funding stage, blueprinting and building, pre-seed, searching for product market fit, seed, achieve product market fit, Series A, hyperscaling growth, Series B, exiting the arena happens after Series B plus. So you're probably in Series C funding, Series D funding. I think that's like the final stages. You really don't go beyond Series C, D, and E, unless there was some kind of bump in the market that was uncontrollable on your behalf, okay? So at your pre-seed phase, you're deciding to launch the company, okay? You probably already have your mind made up. And at the end of the pre-seed phase, you're getting the first check. I don't know many people who get a first check at that stage, but that's pretty much what it is. And then at the seed funding, you're hiring your team. At Series A, you're gaining early customer traction. I think it depends on what the market is, but that's typically what happens. Securing the next capital infusion, Series B, and then at the exit, you're evolving your operating model. All of this is true. I think this is a really good formula as well for people who don't know what it's like to be in the startup space. I've worked for a couple of startups, so that I kind of understand. 4 key actions for stakeholders. It's clear that investing time, money, and resources into underrepresented founders is both a crucial step in social equity and economic imperative. The stakes for investors are high: outsized returns, particularly in the near term, and greater innovation for customers and consumers in underserved markets. Stakeholders who figured out how to effectively act now stand to gain by leaps and bounds. We identify 4 actions that stakeholders can take now to move the needle. Number 1, intentionally hire and promote women and BIPOC individuals as investors. Number 2, increase the flow of cash and capital investments that benefit women and BIPOC founders and investors. Number 3, deploy networks, industry knowledge, and customer relationships to benefit women and BIPOC founders and investors. Number 4, develop and transparently track standardized DEI metrics to drive accountability across 3 solution areas. This is all fine and good. I don't see anything wrong with this, but I think language is actually going to play a significant role in who this relates to. A lot of your pro-Black people may have a problem with some of the language here, but the formula actually works just fine if you play it out well. Okay. Several types of investors stand to gain from the outperformance of gender and ethnically diverse portfolios: individual investors, companies, investing institutions, and government actors. Success will look different for each type of investor. For companies, building programs to bring innovative offerings can deliver value to current and new customers, as well as employees. Government actors can stimulate entrepreneurship and drive wealth creation and employment for women and ethnically diverse citizens. We've talked about this before. Okay. The $100 billion that the DoD allocates for research and development to these institutions, academic institutions. The $500 billion that the military gets for contracting, Black people get less than 1% to that, okay? You could do a lot with $500 billion. You could do a lot with $100 billion. Hell, you can do a lot with $1 billion, okay? $1 billion is a lot to work with. But what's happening here is the sort of products and services that Black people are offering are not being seen as viable for the market that they're targeting, only because they're Black. Now, when it's white founders, that's different. It changes. Okay. I remember there was a product back in the 90s called the Flowbee. Okay, this vacuum cleaner hair cutting device that, it helps people cut their hair to save time going to the barbershop. Well, whoever did the research and development on that, clearly they did not test that on Black people's hair, because Black people's 4C and 3C and whatever type of hair types that they had were incompatible with this device. Okay. But they raised a lot of money to get this off the ground, and the product is a failure now. Nobody would ever use that now. People would laugh at you. But that's the sort of thing that happens, right? White people are able to rationalize really bad products and services while at the same time raise a lot of money for these bad products and services, and nobody questions the legitimacy of the track record of white failed products and services. Okay. All right, number 1, intentionally hire and promote women and BIPOC individuals. Investors, research shows that a more diverse pool of check writers naturally lead to a more diverse portfolio. The current ecosystem in which AUM is heavily concentrated in the hands of white men check writers requires an intentional shift in hiring and promotion practices to accelerate the representation of women and BIPOC check writers. Opportunities for improvement. While the examples demonstrate a start in promoting diversity in investors' roles, there is significant opportunity to push further on the institutional investors' side. The gap is even wider for limited partners. Several actions can help. Push for at least 2 women and BIPOC candidates in the hiring pool of any check writer role. Research shows that the likelihood of hiring a woman or a BIPOC candidate grows by 79 or 194 times, respectively, if there are at least 2 candidates in the finalist pool. Hire externally when internal pools do not provide enough diverse talent. Build partnerships with pipeline programs for a pool of top-notch investor candidates. Focus on retention practices for women and BIPOC investors at the top. It's hard to actually, I'm not gonna deliberate on that. Reflect on progress. How does the diversity of your organization's capital allocators compared to the diversity of the United States or the city or state in which your organization is based. This is a very true statement because, for example, Boston is a majority minority city. Okay, it's 56, 57% non-white. You don't see that reflected in any of the organizations within the city. It's just not reflected at all. Okay, there's a lot of people who have never been here who think that Boston is a white dominated city, but it's only white dominated within the corporate sector itself, not necessarily at the population level. Okay, it's more non-white people that live here than there are actual white people. But the news, the media will make it seem like these people are the only people that live here. That's it, because they don't actually care to really interview Black people, and they don't care to show Black people at that level. And so, does the diversity reflect that of the city that it's city and the state that they're in? I don't see it being represented. I mean, we looked at the numbers all the time, and it's just not there. What goals has your organization set for diversity and capital allocator roles, if any? What partnerships has your organization formed to facilitate successful recruiting and retention of women and BIPOC investors? Sometimes their networks are so broad, they don't even have, and I'm speaking for white founders, they don't even need to tap into Black and Indigenous people for investors because they already have a broad network, and so they don't even care. Number 2, increase the flow of cash and capital investments that go to women and BIPOC check writers. Commit to investing in women and BIPOC founders and check writers by addressing unconscious biases, setting goals, and broadening your sources of your sourcing pool. Many stakeholders are making progress in this area by doing the following. Leaders are intentionally addressing biases in the due diligence process. Traditional limited partners are making a concerted effort to invest in diverse founders and managers. Government companies and other organizations are stepping in to provide grants to more accessible funding mechanisms. This is something we've talked about before. I think cities and states and the Fed should provide more grants to underrepresented founders, more importantly, Black founders, right? And I'm not talking about, $2,000, $3,000. I'm talking about, it should start at $50,000. I know the SBA has a seed program, but I have yet to get any sort of data that reflects that they're actually doing any of this. And they make you compete for it, which I think is really brutal because there's such limited resources to go around. You're making people compete for something that, the white guys don't have to compete for. It's just really discouraging. So, but we have talked about that before. State government funds are investing in women and BIPOC emerging managers and committing to grow their allocations over time. That should be a part of their portfolio, right? Your elected officials, your comptrollers and whatnot, they should be looking at diversifying their supply chain so that they can have Black people a part of that supply chain, and so that Black people are getting access to offering their products and services. Okay. Opportunities and improvement. Commit to processes to receive and review code outreaches. Pursue strategies to eliminate bias in outreach, review, and due diligence. Consider expanding your organization's investment thesis to include a focus on underrepresented founders and investors. A lot of this was already done during the pandemic, right? After George Floyd, you heard a lot of these publicly traded organizations talking about how much billions of dollars they're going to pledge to, Black startups and this and that. Now, most of that has dissipated already, especially after the Supreme Court decisions last week on eliminating race as a consideration for academic institutions. But the few companies that have made these commitments, Google, with Fund Black Founders, the hashtag, they're doing a lot of $100 million of investment there. Amazon with their Black Accelerator startup program, I think that that's a really good step too. I think the NBA has made a lot of commitments too. They put their money where their mouth is. Apple has made some considerable investments by putting some money into some in Atlanta and Detroit, opening up, these research labs, creative labs, I think that's what they call them, and tapping HBCUs for hiring. I know that AWS also offers something as well. I know Comcast has made their investments into some of these Black nonprofit organizations that focus on tech as well. And so I think there's a handful of companies that's doing this, but I don't think that the majority of these publicly traded organizations are just doing this. I don't see it. If they have, they've stopped, because I don't see the numbers reflected there. And the numbers that we've covered the last few months shows that there's been a downward trajectory in funding and diversifying their portfolio for Black founders. Okay. Reflect on progress. What percent of your organization's capital is invested in women and BIPOC founders? Many of them not going to open up these books now. Some of it is for fear of, being sued because of discrimination against white people, and the other half is they just don't have the numbers to reflect it. Okay, they don't have it. How does your organization screen and evaluate for potential investments? Number 3, leverage non-monetary strength to level the playing field for women and BIPOC founders and investors. Underrepresented founders often lack supporters who are willing to put their social capital on the line to connect them to investors and customers. To be of real use beyond a check, organizations need to consider how they can deploy their unique knowledge, connections, and resources in support of underrepresented founders after they invest. A number of institutions are making plays. Companies are integrating startups into their platform based on revenue models. Institutions are forming partnerships to collectively connect startups with access to capital, customers, and industry expertise. Investment-focused institutions are developing programs to meaningfully provide resources to underrepresented founders, which can expand their investment markets and increase their interest from a variety of stakeholders. Institutions are starting to amplify alternative funding vehicles, for example, permanent capital, invoice, and debt-based financing. Diversity-focused venture capital firms and other organizations are starting to incorporate a focus on mental health in their model. Yeah, we saw that with what's the gymnast, Simone Biles, I think it was. And they had that mental health app when she took a time away from the Olympics to focus on mental health. I think that that's what they're referring to. Opportunities for improvement: commit to offering expertise on a specific topic or skill set tailored to an underrepresented founder's needs. Commit to connecting underrepresented founders with other investors, customers, and resources to meaningful and structured ways. Develop mutually beneficial programs or partnerships for underrepresented founders that tap into your organizational strengths. Accelerate the development of alternative funding vehicles to benefit underrepresented founders. I think that's the really key point here to take away, is that I've been saying this, for quite some time on this channel, that the traditional way of us raising capital has to change. It doesn't work. The numbers don't reflect that it works, and so we need to change the way we do business. Okay. Develop programming for key topics for startup founders, such as types of funding, how to raise capital, and watchouts. Reflect on progress. How do you, or how does your organization interact with sponsors, or sponsors underrepresented founders? What sources, knowledge, or connections do you or does your organization uniquely have that you could use to elevate women and BIPOC founders? I think the first point is really critical. Jason Calacunis on YouTube, who has the channel, let me see if I can get it right. What's the name of Jason's channel? Oh man, I'm slipping right now. Oh, This Week in Startups. I think Jason became an ally to Black people after George Floyd. He started calling out a lot of your white VC and seed funders for not having diversity in their portfolios. He brought on a lot of Black founders as well, and venture capitalists to express the lack of diversity in the tech industry. And so I think people like Jason Calacunis are really spot on, especially especially this point right here that says, how do you or your organization interact or sponsor underrepresented founders? Yeah, that's pretty much what has to happen. When you see certain people talk about, Black founders just need to really step it up or make some form of, side-eye excuse, I think what happens here, you have to question what their track record is in working with underrepresented founders, especially Black founders. Number 4, develop and implement standardized metrics to drive accountability and transparency across these 3 solutions. Yeah, metrics would make a lot of sense if you had any sort of investment or participatory action inside these areas of the market. If you don't have it, you're not going to have any metrics to measure. I mean, that's just the reality. All your metrics are going to be 0. Okay. Opportunities for improvement. So last paragraph, the opportunity for improvement for this action is simple: make more public commitments and measure outcomes. Organizations that have made commitments can consider being more transparent about their progress. But we saw that during the pandemic, right? I think a lot of companies said a lot of the right things, but they didn't actually provide any action behind it, right? And so from a PR standpoint, they did all the right things. They just did not follow up with it at all. So therefore, there's no metrics to actually measure them by. So therefore, you can't hold them to anything. And so therefore, there's no transparency. It's a slick game, man. It's a cold game out here. It's really slick. And that's pretty much what we're dealing with here. Okay. But that's where we are right now with this. I think that I think this was a pretty good report. I know it's boring and it's kind of dry, but it's actually necessary that we read through this together so that we can have an understanding as to where the market is for Black people in the startup arena. Okay. I know there's a lot of people in this space who like to get on panels with their Black pill talk and whatnot and tell you that we're over here talking about economics, but I can tell you right now, you're not talking about this. Okay. You're not talking about the $1.6 trillion of an economy that we could have if we can actually level the playing field, if we can come up with alternative funding vehicles and models. Okay. I was in Ghana last year in October. I should post some pictures. I don't even know where my pictures are right now, but I was invited to the the FinTech Summit over in Ghana, in Accra, and they were talking about de-dollarization. They were talking about alternative funding vehicles for raising money for startups. Ghana has one of the more emerging startup sectors in Africa, rather than like Nigeria. Nigeria is more dominant player when it comes to startups because there's such a ubiquity of talent over there. They have a very diverse talent pool over there, and they're very ambitious. South Africa is another hub for startup. In fact, they're probably like one of the most stable hubs because they have a different sort of region that they deal with in relation to the rest of the continent. And then you start talking about Kenya, Kigali, Rwanda is probably one of the hot areas right now. But the point that I'm making here is that, I've been tracking this type of stuff for years so I can get a better understanding and present this sort of information to the rest of the Black manosphere as to what's happening in these spaces and how do we actually engage going forward. And I think what's happening in the manosphere is that a lot of folks are afraid to come down this path, because then you actually have to stop actually discussing some of the more mundane subjects that get constantly talked about in this space, and actually start talking about things that are going to be more palatable to Black men and collectively. Okay. MOT is a truck driver. He can tell you that raising, buying trucks and stuff, that stuff is expensive. You know why, JB Hunt and some of these other trucking logistics organizations can, buy fleets of trucks and stuff like that? They get a nice tax break. Okay. They can write that stuff off all day long. Why can't we look at the same perspective when it comes to Black truckers? Black people care about the environment too. Black people care about logistics and just-in-time operations too. Yeah, Black people would buy more fuel-efficient vehicles if they had the same tax breaks and incentives, but they don't. It's no different. The access to capital is the main challenge for a lot of Black businesses, especially in the tech sector. Okay, Black people would be involved in autonomous vehicles too. No money. Not to be made, but to be raised. And so these are the sort of issues that we run into. We're all in the same boat. So we have these sort of discussions so that we can actually, engage each other and massage some of this information so that we can actually come up with some better alternatives. I think the article, the report does a pretty good job at, engaging some of this, but I think that also, the manosphere should be on top of this. DOD, $100 billion, who knew? Black people were getting less than 1% of that, okay? Black people getting less than 1% of venture capital, that's, a half $1 trillion. Who knew? You have content creators and people in the space on panels dancing for joy because, the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, saying we don't need it. Okay. You got people drawing stick figures on panels about Kamala Harris and arguing whether or not she's Black. I mean, this is the sort of conversation that goes on in this space. Let's just be real. Go to people's community tabs. Go see what they're sharing on their community tabs. I can guarantee you they're not talking about this. $1.6 trillion economy that Black people can be actually generating. Africa has a $1.6 trillion economy to themselves. How come Black people don't understand that in order for us to move forward, we have to move forward with the continent? If we have $1.6 trillion economy, when all things are equal, and Africa has a $1.6 trillion economy, when all things are equal, What happens when we start putting our economies together? When we start globalizing? Okay. We have to be a part of both conversations, domestically and internationally on the continent and in the Caribbean and Latin America. We have to be a part of all those conversations. We have to be a part of the growth. And unfortunately, you have too many people in this space who refuse to acknowledge that your ADOS, FBA movement isn't working. It's not manifesting anything. This is where the rubber meets the road. Okay. That being said, the link is in the chat if anybody wants to come up. If not, we could peel up out of here. Any other news? I don't really have anything else to share in terms of anything critical that's happening, but I do think that we're missing out big time on some of these discussions. Okay. Let me see who's in the chat room. Emmanuel Briggs, what's going on? Shonda H, good evening to you. Check your email. I sent you something. Or at least I think I sent you something. Chipper Jabber, what's going on? AO piece, Spawn the Programmer piece. XL Pro, what's going on? Yeah. Friday night, I've been meaning to cover some of these topics. I just think that timing has been really crucial for me, going back to school right now and whatnot. But that's not going to stop me from having this conversation. Definitely never going to stop me from having this conversation. They're having the same problem on the continent. Okay, having a hard time raising money for their startups. So this information becomes relevant to all of us as to what can we do, what kind of alternative vehicles can we create. We have to think outside of the box. Okay. We have to think outside of the box. And if a lot of brothers are afraid to think outside the box, they'd rather blame women for all their problems. I'm not one of those Negroes. Okay. I have no interest in blaming Black women for these problems right here that we're seeing on screen. No interest in that. No matriarchy, no gynocracy, nothing of any sort would allow me to engage in that discussion. I have no interest in that. I don't care about Kiki Palmer and the Essence Festival and, Janelle Monáe. I don't care about all that. I care about where the monies are and how are we going to get to it. Okay. All right. With that being said, man, thank you all for joining. Please hit the like button on your way out.